Welcome back to the Millennial-Review, the podcast where we analyze the current political, cultural, and socioeconomic crises we face from the perspective of the most indebted and disenfranchised generation in history. I'm your host, Justin, here with another news roundup episode. I'm going to try something new with the content this week and try and make some more content for the patrons and just get more content out generally. I don't know how it'll go. I've said lots of things like this on the podcast and social media lots of times in the past, and then nothing has come of it. So don't hold me to that, but hopefully that's a thing that happens this week and maybe more weeks going forward, and get more content for the patrons, get more content for everyone. Patrons, thank you so much. If you want to help make all of this possible, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/millennial-review. If you can't do that, leave us a 5-star review in Apple Podcasts. That really helps as well. Thank you so much for listening and all of that. But I really just want to start today's episode with a discussion and update on COVID. Usually we save those for when Trevor and I have the time to get together and make an episode, but I think I just want to talk not like specifically about the kinds of things Trevor and I might talk about in a COVID update segment where he is the data person and brings all the like perspective on herd immunity and like the real like nitty gritty stuff that people care about when it comes to COVID. I am more interested right now though in some of the like political machinations surrounding COVID, and particularly reopening and the debate around reopening that's not actually a debate in a lot of states, where conservative governors are just basically acting as though we have defeated COVID, when in reality, obviously, that is not the case, and now we are heading towards another spike. How significant that will be remains to be seen, how that plays with the vaccination effort and those who are already vaccinated, and whether that tempers it and all of that, because it is tempering it among the elderly and groups of people who are significantly vaccinated. So it kind of, we'll have to see how this plays out, but it's just a fact that the Republican death cult marches on in some ways. Because even though almost a third of the country has received at least one dose and almost 20% of the country is fully vaccinated, the stage at which we can open up is still far off. We're still at a point where it makes sense to pay people to stay home and shut down the economy again in a way that we did basically a year ago, because in between this last year we have not done anything to get a handle on COVID the way that we should have, as we've discussed on this podcast time and time again. And now we're finally at a point with the vaccine where the supply issues aren't a thing really anymore, and a lot of states are opening vaccines up to everyone over the age of 16, everyone over the age of 18, and that is obviously really, really important. And like in the last podcast where Trevor and I discussed COVID, the light at the end of the tunnel is obviously there. But when you see a 20% 14-day increase in new cases, deaths are still declining, but obviously, as we've discussed this entire time, that's a lagging indicator. And it might be the case that because of the percentage of the country that has at least one dose, the percentage of the country that's fully vaccinated, some of those, like the deaths, are less of a lagging indicator. They're less significant, but I don't think you can say that with any certainty, and definitely not enough for states as big as Texas to just be running with it and opening up completely in a way that obviously puts thousands and thousands of people, millions of people at risk, and we're just not at that point yet. And again, it's a broader, like, it's the Republican Party and Republican governors are willing to just keep leaning into it, especially the narrative that we've discussed the entire time, that it's like bad for business to keep things closed or whatever. That's obviously very strong, especially this late into the pandemic, when everyone really does just want to go out and do things and get life back to normal in some ways. That's obviously like an understandable urge, and one that like it makes it even more important for our elected officials to respond in a way that's like substantive and actually enables people to stay home, actually curtails the virus, and actually makes a significant dent in like the long-term death, because we are still marching on into up like a higher and higher death count in a significant way, even if it's going down, even if there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So it's just ultimately It's obviously really disappointing. It's obviously disappointing to see like people just like embrace it, but on some level it's been so long, and now we're in this weird middle period where some people can safely go out and do things and things should be open, but like at the same time there are like that's not enough of a justification for the amount of death this is still causing. It's not it never was really, but now it's going to be even harder to make that case, and that case was not really going to be made in like a substantive way anyway at this point, so it doesn't really matter, I suppose. But we like COVID continues, obviously, as everyone knows. We are still living with that, and the cases are increasing, even though the amount of vaccinated people is as well. So we'll see how that like all shakes out. I just think COVID is kind of being treated as though it's over, as though it's done, and really we should still be having discussions of stimulus packages, of helping people stay on unemployment, helping things stay closed. Like that should be a serious discussion that we're having, but it's just not gonna happen. And there is other discussions in government to that are ongoing, that are important, that maybe we'll have some more attention focused to them, like Joe Biden's like infrastructure and immigration bills and all of those things that the Senate Democrats will and Joe Manchin will hopefully not kill, and some things that will be substantive enough in the face of COVID that it's kind of a response in and of itself to the long-term consequences of COVID and our inability to deal with it. But like the sheer lack of like role it's going to play in the discussion going forward, combined with the reopenings, combined with the like death that all of that causes, is just going to set up for a like really depressing dynamic where I think for the next 6 to 8 months, as we march towards like herd immunity and like fully vaccinated population, it's going to just kind of be like a slow drip of awfulness and the continued like lack of response that we've seen this entire time. And at this point, it's all been so normalized that I really do think for a lot of Republican governors, they're kind of making the right political calculation in a really sad and unfortunate way, because people are tired of being at home. People are tired of the pandemic, obviously, and leaning into the palpable sense that it's almost over, that you can go back to normal, that everything is fine, and letting people do what they want to do, and the like background death of it all has just been normalized to a degree that doesn't even matter anymore. Like it just obviously it was going to happen this way, and the Republican governors like Kristi Noem, for example, who have roasted many a time on the podcast, like is the prime offender here, like never having a mask mandate, never really shutting down, and now like being a champion of that for people who were forced to respond in a more substantive way, even if it was just like the bare minimum. But it's all become baked into the Republican Party in some ways, that you have to oppose a like meaningful response just on the politics of it at this point. And there's not even really, and that's the like second component I wanted to get into a little bit there, is like there's not even going to be a meaningful response because the politics of it are kind of done, I think, with the American Rescue Plan having passed. Like there obviously needs to be more stimulus. Like there needs to be significant structural investments and changes, like that, the likes of which Trevor and I discussed on our last podcast going over the American Rescue Plan. There needs to be more there, obviously, but that's not even like, I'll get into Biden's infrastructure package in a little bit, because I think things like that are like the replacement to a continued COVID response. But again, the discussion should be on like, hey, this isn't over. The problems that this is supposed to solve like are still going to be intensified, and we still need to like figure out if that was enough, like what we need to do next, blah 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 blah. People probably need more stimulus checks, like all of that is real, but that discussion is just kind of over because of the triumphant we passed the bill, we got it through like narrative that the Biden administration's kind of leaning into for obvious reasons, and some of it is due, like that's fine, but there needs to be more understanding, and the fact that there needs to be more understanding that this isn't over and people still need a lot of material relief. and the fact that we've entered like a new era of government, and things like Biden's infrastructure bill is like $2 trillion, and that's pretty significant, and does in some ways respond to some of the problems that COVID's causing in the economy. But at the same time, like, again, that is not like a targeted acute response to all of those various problems on like a significant level. And it's also not necessary, like, it's problematic to just move the discussion onto that. And I do think, though, that the fact that Biden is pushing a $2 trillion infrastructure package after a $2 trillion stimulus package, like, again, this is significant. That's a lot of money, but it's still not enough. Like, even with that recognition, the fact that the left flank of the Democratic Party, like AOC and Bernie Sanders, are pushing for $10 trillion and a number like up there, like that. And even then, like, you could debate, like, in the face of climate change, in the face of the need for like rural broadband and building that infrastructure out in a significant way, like high speed rail around the country, all of the things that like a real serious infrastructure package could accomplish in the United States, like 10 trillion might not even be enough, if we're being frank, especially in the face of climate change, that being the biggest one there. And I want to break it down like more specifically, and talk about what Biden's proposing and what it does, and the fact that even people like Joe Manchin are kind of saying we need to go bigger, and that, I think, is good in some ways. It bodes well. Maybe Biden will see that as a reason to step up. But before I get into that, I want to go back to the COVID thing, because I think it's easy to blame the Republican Party still, but the like mission accomplished George W. Bush, like a couple years into the war in Iraq type like dynamic that the Democrats have struck with COVID here. The like, we passed the stimulus package, mission accomplished, we can walk away, it's done. Like, we're battling it, we're opening schools, and like the head in the sand, the like dynamic that takes to like let that first dynamic play out. Like, you have to like willingly just like lean into the fact that there is still a lot more death than there was like when we didn't, like when we locked down and everything the first time. There is still a lot more cases, and that like we don't have as serious a vaccination effort as we could have, and that there is like all of these things we could work out better. But the like urge to move on, to pass the infrastructure bill, to do all that, like that also plays into the like death cult dynamic, and makes it so even though there was some response, and you could debate like the response from the Republicans and, you know, the CARES Act versus everything else that was passed, the American Rescue Plan, you can debate all of that, but like the lack of the like smaller response to the like, okay, we can go to the next issue, that's maybe not as bad as the like calloused like 8 months of nothingness from the Republicans, but it's still pretty bad, and is only tempered by the fact that vaccinations are ramping up, and there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and like 6 to 8 months from now, that like not doing anything might seem a lot more reasonable than it did for 8 months for the Republicans. But all of that said, like, this is still that like George W. Bush mission accomplished sort of dynamic, and it's not over, even if Democrats want to pretend it is. And again, the like ongoing discussions of infrastructure bills or other spending or reforms, like if it's not in direct response, if it's not directly to like snuff out the pandemic as quickly as possible, if that's not like made for like long-term structural thinking in the way that will need to account for the like devastation that the last year has caused, then it's not enough. It's not actually going to solve those problems, and it's just trying to basically do business as usual, even though that looks a little different than it has historically in the last like decade or so. It's just business as usual, trying to get credit for a COVID response by like rhetorically saying that's what it is, even though that's not what it is. But all that said, there is a lot in Joe Biden's infrastructure package, the $2.5 trillion dollars, that is worth discussing, even though again we could be discussing $10 trillion infrastructure packages and still have complaints about how it's not enough in the face of climate change, in the face of whatever else. So that's an important dynamic to always keep in mind. And even Joe Manchin, conservative, stopping everything. Joe Manchin, he threatened to block the infrastructure package if they don't go bigger, if they don't think $4 trillion or more. So I think there's a lot of room for that. And I think there's a big difference between an infrastructure package that something or someone like Joe Manchin can co-sign that's like grifty enough, that's bad enough in those ways for Joe Manchin to get on board, and one that is better, more targeted, actually achieve some of the goals that like we on this podcast might want to see it do, like a more Green New Deal-esque type spending effort. And I think that is, obviously we live in a moment where that sort of thing's possible. We live in a moment where like that idea is on the left, but that's a very different thing than like a bigger version of the Obama stimulus. And again, it's important to keep in mind that like the Obama stimulus was $800 billion ish, and that the stimulus there was also a response to the economic fallout of 2008, 2009 and everything that was happening then. And it was like a direct response to that, but it was also an infrastructure bill in some ways, allowed for infrastructure spending and that sort of thing to happen. And I think it's just, again, always important to keep that in context, that the response and that bill was like one $800 billion package. And right now we're talking about two separate $2 trillion bills from Joe Biden. And the most conservative Democrat is saying we actually need to go bigger. We need to do 4. And the left flank of the Democratic Party saying that's not even close. We need 10. And so I think it's just, again, one of those things that if you're being honest, if we're being real with the moment we're in, there are big differences in the amount of money people are willing to spend. And go listen to Trevor's MMT podcast to get a better sense of that, or join us on Patreon and come to book club and discuss it with us. But it is a different moment in many ways, and that opens the door to, even though Joe Biden's stimulus is still inadequate, it does a lot more than we would get in the past. It's looking to phase out diesel. I'm going to get into it specifically now, I guess, because it does a lot of different things. It wants to electrify large swaths of government vehicles and the like grid to the extent that it can. It wants to invest heavily in education and like the like actual like buildings and schools and those sorts of things, and creating new schools, new federal offices to help achieve these goals, bring broadband all across the country, particularly rural broadband, some defense stuff and research and development, and then a bunch of like tax credit things. And I'll get into these more specifically in a second. But again, I just like, before I do, highlight the fact that the just price tag here allows a lot more to be done. And one thing that I think is interesting and really useful is the idea that the Biden administration wants to electrify at least a fifth of U.S. school buses and do the same for USPS. And it wants to convert the entire fleet of federal vehicles to electric. That's 650,000 vehicles. And I think that's really important, particularly in the case of USPS, because I think I would guess that would be like Amazon, US or UPS or FedEx's like next selling point. And if the USPS doesn't get ahead of it, doesn't say, hey, we've electrified, we're carbon neutral in some way, like that is just one more thing that the opponents of the Postal Service can use to degrade its image and make its functionality even less so than it is and than it needs to be. So I think that's big, and it also has tangible climate impact, obviously. But again, that like needs to be in the backdrop of all of this discussion. Like any infrastructure bill also needs to be a climate change bill on some level, and if it's not, it's just inadequate. And I think this like nods to that notion, but isn't like embracing it enough, because it's just not enough. But again, that's a critique you can use of basically anything Joe Biden's gonna do, probably. So we'll unpack it a little bit more. It would spend $174 billion on a network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations to go with the electrification of that bus and USPS fleet. About $115 billion would pay for fixing roads and bridges. That's not very much money given the like state of America's civil engineering infrastructure. That's not the right words, but given the state of that infrastructure, that's not nearly enough money. Um, 85 billion is set aside for modernizing transit systems, and 80 billion for Amtrak repairs and route expansion specifically. Airports, ports, and waterways also have some money. There is 50 billion for infrastructure resiliency, to withstand climate-related disasters specifically. I think obviously every time there's a hurricane now, not every time, but a lot of them become pretty significant infrastructure debilitating events, and that's important to make up for. There's 20 billion for to connect neighborhoods historically cut off by investment, whatever that means. And again, 20 billion is not nearly enough there, but whatever. There's a housing component to all of this that's about $650 billion total. 213 billion of that would be spent to make affordable housing and commercial buildings more like economical, to retrofit them and to rehabilitate 500,000 homes for low and middle income homeowners, with an additional 111 billion going to clean drinking water, including the replacement of all lead pipes and service lines. So I think that right there is actually obviously pretty important, especially given the experience of Flint, Michigan, and other places. And I think also like a direct response to the criticism that Barack Obama faced for his handling of Flint, obviously. And it's just one of those instances where Joe Biden is doing better than Obama, and I think intentionally so. But in addition to that 111 billion, there would be 100 billion for modernizing public schools, with another 100 billion to build high-speed broadband networks throughout the country, with a goal of eventually creating universal broadband and driving down the cost of internet. I'm not sure 100 billion is enough there. There are discussions of spending 5 or 10 times that much for that exact project, but I think that it's a start, and it's obviously attached to, again, that goal of universalizing broadband, and that's an important recognition at the very least. 40 billion set aside specifically for public housing, 18 million for the VA hospitals and clinics, 12 billions for community college infrastructure, and 16 million specifically to plug oil and gas wells and reclaim abandoned mines. And again, there's good stuff there. It's just same problem. The overall price tag isn't enough. So once you break it down, you're just kind of not giving any of these areas enough. But it's better than nothing. Again, an improvement on the Obama era. The next part is, I think, it's one of those areas where I think it will be kind of pitched as like a response to COVID in some ways, and also is like lacking in other ways because there are just other solutions here. And that's specifically Biden wants to spend $400 billion to help fund community-based healthcare and home healthcare for elderly people and people with disabilities, by expanding a Medicaid program. And there's a lot of good there. Obviously, that is like a need in our economy, and there's also a need to pay those workers well, which is why it's like, if you want to invest in that, that's really great. But there also needs to be some understanding that the workers are severely underpaid, and that something like a $15 minimum wage is like disproportionately going to help a huge amount of low income, disproportionately women and women of color workers in our economy, and that's just not. That's not going to happen, obviously, the $15 minimum wage part, but creating more of those jobs, and creating those jobs that help people stay in their homes, help people live meaningful lives, that's obviously hugely important. And again, though, it's never enough money. And so the last chunk of money is about $300 million that would be spent on various research and development schemes. About half of it would be spent on clean energy, creating fewer emissions, climate change research, all of that. And that includes $100 billion for worker training and an increase in worker protection systems, whatever that means. I obviously, it's like the coal miners go learn how to code or get a job installing solar panels type thing. But all of that said, you know, there's a bunch of R&D money here, but it's all, when you just consider the scale here, $2 trillion from Biden, Manchin's asking for $4 trillion, the left is asking for 10, and then consider that like Bernie Sanders campaigned on like a $10+ trillion infrastructure package plus a $16 trillion Green New Deal. So we're talking $26 trillion of spending total. And that's on top of like Medicare for all and everything else that obviously plugs different holes in our economy and affects just like the total economic like environment in which all of this stuff happens in a way that just like is kind of fundamentally transformative for American society. So it's just like the scale of the investment here, especially again once you put it in the like context of climate change, just like simply is not enough. But it again is better than Obama. So Joe Biden is leaning into that narrative that Politico said he likes, where he is bolder and better and bigger thinking than Obama, which isn't that hard to do, especially given that we have a global pandemic and like economic fallout that falls from that. Like it's kind of obvious, I guess, in some ways that Joe Biden would be bigger and bolder than Obama. But I think this is an example where that bigger and bolder is only bigger and bolder in comparison to Obama, because in comparison to even Joe Manchin, this is not enough. He wants it doubled. And obviously in comparison to like the boldest campaign ambitions of Bernie Sanders or like the boldest positioning of AOC or someone who has proposed $10+ trillion proposals in the past, this is clearly not enough. So it's just it's like the COVID response thing, in the sense that the response to COVID in general and the like economic fallout has never been there. It's never, even though it has forced everyone's hand and forced a new era of politics in some ways, it's not been as significant as it needs to be. And the infrastructure package, just given the state of infrastructure in the United States in so many different areas, so many facets of that problem, like it's not enough either. And that it's hard because that could just come off as like sour grapes, as like it's like never going to be enough. And that's something I've complained about from other people on the left related to Joe Biden and other people in the past. And it's just like, this is an area where like just the numbers though and the proposed plans of, again, like people like Bernie Sanders and others, are just, the mismatch is significant enough that it's not just sour grapes. This is a real tangible failure to respond to various infrastructure crises in a like fundamental way. And especially when you consider that we haven't had an effort to like the last significant investment there in a really meaningful way was the Obama stimulus, and that like obviously wasn't anything like near enough when you compare that to the numbers you need. And the like talk of infrastructure week or whatever in the Trump administration never materialized. And if $2 trillion's all that happens, it's obviously better than nothing in some ways, but it just needs to be bigger. It needs to be bolder. And this is a moment for that sort of thinking. So hopefully the left and their $10 trillion ambitions can win the day in some sense, and at least push this to like a Joe Manchin level. And it seems like if Joe Manchin can support it, there's no reason not to, other than like concerns about, the debt or whatever, that you should go listen to all of Trevor's MMT content to get a sense for why that might be kind of silly. And I guess one other concern, and to tie this into a rough transition here, is the blowback potentially from the Republican Party, which again I think is inherently tied up in concerns over the debt, because that's like the traditional line there, I suppose. But I think when looking at the Republican Party right now, they're kind of dysfunctional, and I don't mean to make much of that, because I think the like early years of being in an opposition party is kind of dysfunctional. And I think that the like Trump coalition lives on, is still a potent political force, to be sure. And it's like going to manifest whenever the midterms and next election come around. But until then, there's the flailing of the cancel culture narrative and just like what Fox and this like media political infrastructure has to do to keep people engaged and entertained or whatever. And that doesn't look very powerful all of the time. And especially I think when the party is just dysfunctional on a level that it's the actual power brokers in the party don't look much better than some of those like silly narratives. And I guess I'm thinking of in this particular instance Matt Gaetz and the sex trafficking and prostitution investigation that the Department of Justice initiated that was leaked. That, I mean, obviously he denied all of the claims there and now has gone on the like media tour of the right, decrying leaks from the Department of Justice, like harkening back to like a narrative of the like earliest Trump days. And I think obviously that signals in some ways like directly that the playbook here is the Trump playbook. And I think that's obvious. And the like far right caucus of the like House of Representatives, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Jim Jeffries, people like that, have all come out in support of Matt Gaetz and like the narrative there that he is spinning, that particularly Newsmax and One America News are spinning because he went on the Tucker Carlson show, and I'll play some clips there that both like explain the narrative that he's spinning, but also Tucker Carlson's response, because Tucker was not necessarily buying it. And I think if you're Matt Gaetz, like Tucker Carlson is the biggest mainstream platform in the conservative movement that you could go on and have like a friendly reception to in this moment in your political career. And I do think that like, while he's just a House rep and like a slimy, shitty one at that, he's one that we've talked about a lot on the podcast because he fits the like Trumpian mold in some ways and like very intentionally cultivated the right side of the Republican Party, very intentionally cultivated the Republican Party in that way. And like in the like Fox News, like media circus sort of way that like Donald Trump has, like that is Matt Gaetz's MO, to go on. I remember very vividly in the run up to the 2018 like midterm, when the caravan narrative was really big in the news. Matt Gaetz was one of the main proponents of that. He was on Fox really working that up. There was a like long like 15-minute segment of Lou Dobbs where he just went like full like white nationalist almost, and it was a very clear moment that the future of the Republican Party lies in embracing Donald Trump. It still does, but I think moments like this, where even Tucker Carlson has to separate himself, does show that like Trumpism isn't the like Teflon shielding that like provided Donald Trump the ability to withstand like the Access Hollywood tape scandal and just like openly being a rapist as the president. Like that dynamic was not maybe special to Trump. If you look at what's happening with Andrew Cuomo and the fact that he's still in office and it looks like he might just be able to let like slip away potentially. We'll talk about that maybe in a little bit, but there is that sense, I think, after the Tucker Carlson interview, that if Matt Gaetz is to survive this political scandal, it's not because he played it well or something. Like he did not, like, I don't think even Tucker, the most like receptive news host on Fox, probably, I don't think he walked away from that interview saying this is definitely false and we need to double down and protect this guy the same way that some of Gaetz's colleagues in the House did. And so there's just an interesting media dynamic here, and there's an interesting political dynamic here, but ultimately it's all kind of overshadowed by the allegations and how kind of fucked up they are. If Gaetz actually had a relationship with a 17-year-old girl, that's obviously pretty heinous. And some of the reporting coming out detailing the like him talking about like showing nude photos to people on the House floor and stuff, just like really disgusting shit that like I guess isn't really surprising when I like think of who Matt Gaetz is and just like who some of the Republicans in Congress are. but it's also just like, these are Congress people, and that's the kind of like, this is the shit that they do with their power, the shit that they do with their time, like, is not good. And I think is a reflection on, I think, again, like the willingness to engage in some of the heinous shit that Republican Congress people do engage in, and like, you kind of have to be a bad person. Like, that's all I'm saying. And so I will let Matt Gaetz give you his side of the story via the interview with Tucker Carlson, because I think it's a moment where, if you're going to cleave Trumpism from the Republican Party, it's going to be, I think, by taking out these ancillary figures first, and this might be one domino to fall. If maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene is already one, but it's a slow process probably, and this is an important moment in that process, I think. And so here is Matt Gaetz kind of laying out the story from his perspective, and I'll get into more of his rebuttal in a second after I dissect this first part. But I think this is him laying it out, and it's on Tucker Carlson, probably the friendliest like news person he could have chosen that could have fielded this, and at the end Tucker's not very convinced.
It is a horrible allegation, and it is a lie. The New York Times is running a story that I have traveled with a 17-year-old woman, and that is verifiably false. People can look at my travel records and see that that is not the case.
I feel like he's telling on himself a little bit with the 17-year-old woman comment. I mean, maybe I'm looking too much into that, but I don't know. I am the narrative here. I am not really buying it, especially as he gets into the second part where he claims he is being extorted, basically, and I'll play that in a second. But I just think there is a obvious need to separate like himself from the actual allegations, and it's the Trump playbook to a T, especially going on Tucker, especially like feeding the Republican like grievance politics there, acting as though they're coming for him or something, acting as though this is like political impropriety from the DOJ, and conservatives are just primed for that. And obviously there are people in the House caucus who are helping him feed that narrative, but ultimately, like, I'm not very convinced. And again, I'll keep saying this because it's funny to me, neither was Tucker Carlson.
On March 16th, my father got a text message demanding a meeting wherein a person demanded $25 million in exchange for making horrible sex trafficking allegations against me go away.
And Gaetz goes on to like basically dox this attorney who he accuses of being at the center of this extortion ring, and who was like connected to the DOJ and the FBI in particular ways. And that's basically his narrative. And Tucker Carlson like tries to push back on that, basically, you know, eventually going and saying like, hey, they accused you of of having a relationship with a 17-year-old girl. Like, who is that? What is that about? But before he gets there, like, Gaetz is trying to like drag Tucker Carlson down with him, kind of, and say that like he was actually at one of these dinners with this person, and that like this was you know, that it was innocent, but like, and Tucker should know that because he was like personally involved. And I think that is a really interesting moment in this entire interview to me, because I feel like it's like Gaetz in some ways like looking for a lifeline, looking for like help from one of the most influential figures in the conservative movement. And again, I could be looking way too into all of this because I'm just a weird nerd who watches all of this news unfold. But like, I do think that there's something real there, in that Tucker Carlson is one of the most influential conservative figures, if not the most influential conservative figure in the country. And Gaetz is trying to like make this an innocent thing, and Tucker just is like, I don't know what you're talking about. What about the 17-year-old girl? What's going on here? And I guess like maybe he does know what he's talking about, and that's not an innocent deflection. Maybe he genuinely doesn't, and good on him for not like throwing him a lifeline if that's the case, I suppose. Although, you know, it's really hard to give Tucker Carlson credit for anything, especially when it's basically going relatively soft on a potential, you know, real creepy Matt Gaetz. And so this was Tucker's response to that whole thing, and then the end of the interview where he really lets it out, because I think that that kind of says it all, where Gaetz sits in the conservative movement. If Tucker Carlson is broadcasting this interview, has his reaction, and just what that means for Gaetz and his ability to withstand this political scandal that is I think very, very real and threatens his career. And it's only a couple seconds, but Tucker Carlson's reaction just makes me laugh, because I do think that Gaetz was coming to Tucker Carlson as kind of a last hope, as a not maybe a last hope, but as this is the path that he has available to him if it's gonna work for him, if he's gonna withstand it. And this is what Tucker Carlson had to say when it was all said and done.
You just saw our Matt Gaetz interview. That was one of the weirdest interviews I've ever conducted.
And it was pretty weird. And I think the narrative itself is just so blatantly like political on its face that it's hard to take it seriously. It's hard not to accuse, find the allegations like true, basically. Like that is my impulse, that Matt Gaetz is a creep, and the reporting coming out of the way he interacted with other people in Congress about his sexual escapades, questionable in the professional setting that he was in, obviously, and in this instance, the instance that the DOJ was investigating, obviously illegal and disgusting and heinous in a lot of ways, given the stature and power that someone like Matt Gaetz has. It's really not okay, and the fact that Tucker Carlson is distancing himself from Matt Gaetz, I think, is important, and I think again shows how cleaving the like most disgusting elements of Trumpian politics from the Republican Party, like what that looks like. And it remains to be seen whether or not that happens, because again, there is just a high propensity to surviving political scandal right now. And I think Andrew Cuomo is another example of that, and maybe we'll turn to that in a second. Like, it's just it's kind of crazy if you can find the base. And I think this is why Gaetz might be on the way out, actually, is because like part of what makes Cuomo work is that there is this diehard part of the Democratic Party that while these allegations are mounting, and there's 7+ people, and the reporting on the Cuomo scandals, both the sexual harassment, sexual assault stuff, and the nursing home and COVID stuff, like all of that's really substantive and really real, but there's still a segment of the Democratic Party that is so wedded to the idea of Andrew Cuomo as someone who basically guided the Democratic Party through COVID and was a hugely influential figure in that, right? Like, that narrative has a lot of power, that narrative gets a lot of play, and it's really important, I think, in keeping the Cuomo administration afloat, I guess, in the sense that without that like anchor, it would be impossible for him to just ignore it. It would have been, I think the political pressure is already pretty great. The mood to impeach him is there, and to remove him from office in some way is there, and there is like political support growing, and it could still happen. But I think the fact that weeks have gone by, the discussions like died down somewhat. And I'm coming from like outside of New York, so I think if you're on the ground there, it's probably a lot more prevalent still. But it just, I think the power play that Cuomo has been able to like last this long even is a testament to just the resiliency people have in the face of political scandal in this era. And I think Gaetz was looking for that resiliency. He was looking for the like CPAC, like diehard conservative Tucker Carlson viewing base to like take him in and make everything that he's being accused of okay, and make it go away, and make all of this just political theater basically on both sides, to make his base believe that this is just posturing by the FBI and DOJ because Matt Gaetz is a bold Trumpian freedom fighter, or whatever the bullshit narrative will be spun. And I think the fact that Tucker Carlson didn't allow that to happen is important. And I don't want to like look too into it as far as like what it portends for the future, but I do think, given that he was a really Trumpian figure, someone who Fox News like media complex leaned on in important moments to get the Trump message across, and he was more than willing to play that role, and now he is like no longer able to play that role. I just think that that's all really, really important. And it's also just really important to hold him accountable, obviously, if he was, courting, and that is probably not the right word, but like whatever he was doing with a 17-year-old girl, that is obviously just hugely inappropriate on so many levels, and that he needs to be held accountable for in its own right. So I'm like, losing his political career is like the least of what should probably happen to him, and that probably should have happened for a million reasons before this, because he is just like the worst of the worst in many ways. But again, I think when you look at just where everything is politically speaking for other like scandal-ridden politicians, it's just like an era where you can't really count on that accountability, even in the face of like allegations like this, where it should be a no-brainer. It should be just really obvious, and it's not, unfortunately. But that's where Gaetz is at now. There's various other threads to this story that we could pull on, like he made some payments to women using Cash App for, sex work purposes, and I think, and to keep quiet about a relationship, I think. And so there's different angles, but ultimately it just comes down to Matt Gaetz is a really shitty person, and the Republican Party is kind of turned on him. The reporting is not like, it does not look good for him, but he is doubled down. He's trying the Trump playbook, and I think it's just like Cuomo in the sense that it's another one of those moments where you kind of have to see how much is too much, what can actually take a politician down post-Trump, and this is potentially, I would hope, a moment where we see that actually happen. But I think just given like Marjorie Taylor Greene post the 6th, the like cohesion with which the conservative movement acts when they defend their even worst, most radical members, and what people have been willing to absolve other politicians of, I just think that like it should happen. It seems like he's a low enough level and like shitty enough person that like there's just no need to like destroy your own career defending him. But like that, I would have said the same thing about Marjorie Taylor Greene. I would have said the same thing about various other conservatives in different moments. So I'm not going to like say with certainty that he's on the way out, because I think it could be another moment where it's like, damn, you can get away with a lot if you just have a little bit of power, and Matt Gaetz has enough power to get away with a lot potentially, and maybe not. I'm hoping and rooting for not, because he's just like a slimy, shitty person who's on a certain political trajectory as far as being like heir to a certain like segment of Fox News voters and ears and eyes, and to like take him out before he like is able to really cultivate that audience and that part of the conservative movement even more, that's valuable in and of itself. And that's just like blatantly political, and like looking outside all of the real reasons that like you would want to do that, because he's a shitty, slimy person who's engaged in illegal activity that is heinous in and of itself. And I guess it's also just important, again, to like curtail the like far right energy in the Republican Party in some ways, because he directly feeds that whenever given the opportunity. And I guess to make another rough transition to like a little bit of continued coup coverage, I suppose, there has been more reporting detailing the connections between groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, and some of the biggest far-right, most radical far-right groups that has showed that they were in active communication in the run-up to the 6th, that they were actively planning and trying to make this, as successful as possible from their perspective, as far as like actually getting to people in power and engaging in political violence potentially. And this goes hand in hand with the like Coup Paid For It episode and some of the other stuff I've done on it, where just like these groups are more organized than people want to give them credit for. And I think the right as like an institution has always been more organized than people want to give them credit for. And that's something the left should learn from. And I think the moment we live in now, where the like radical far right is the most organized component, and they are using that organization and the infrastructure they have built in the ways that they are, it's like extra important to take notice of that and appreciate it for what it is. And there's also the like response from the Biden administration that is taking this more seriously as like a domestic terror issue, and allegedly is backing off from some of the posture of the Trump administration towards like Antifa and their desire to curtail left-wing groups just as radically or as harshly. But I think obviously that's one of those, like, you believe it when you see it and you'll probably never see it sort of issues, in the sense that I would imagine the Biden administration isn't like, I would imagine that's more like an area of like that's like a localized issue within the FBI, within the DOJ, within DHS. And like, if you are in a region where there's a lot of left-wing activism, like every nail is going to be hit by the hammer that is those state apparatuses. And so if you're like in Portland, that's just what the FBI is doing. Like they're going after left-wing people because that's just what they're tasked to do in some ways, even if the Biden administration isn't deliberately saying it in the same way that the Trump administration was. I think there's still an inherent recognition of the need to protect state power in the face of that kind of organizing, in the face of more radical organizing, and that's always going to be there. And so the like fears of the like domestic terror effort and some of the like early steps the Biden administration's taking to like push back against the far right in like that tangible like law enforcement sort of way, I think those concerns are well placed and they always will be. There's also like just the need to recognize like how organized and like violent the far right is, and obviously like carceral solutions aren't necessarily like going to stop them, because there is like this broader cultural phenomenon that is leading people to the far right that we've discussed on this podcast ad nauseum, and that it's like decades long and deeply rooted in American history and political culture. So you can't just like in some ways like the solution to like white supremacy is not more police and policing of these organizations. Although I think in the short term, like that is like one area where the left might find like support there, and that has to be reckoned with like the broader abolitionist project, because I do think there's like a similar dynamic in a weird way where to actually like root out those reactionary sentiments, you have to have a like find them at their fount sort of approach, the same way you do with abolition. And like that's just me being weird and tangential with it, but I do think there's like an important dynamic there insofar as like understanding that carceral solutions might make up for the fact that people showed up on the 6th and like killed a police officer, and you can hold them accountable for that. That people showed up on the 6th and raided Nancy Pelosi's office, and you can hold them accountable for that. But to actually like deconstruct the sentiments that lead people there on the 6th to begin with is going to take more than a like domestic terrorism bill from Joe Biden. It's going to take more than that effort, and that's like I think an important recognition to have. And I think that's good for the left in some ways, because that carceral approach, those law enforcement approaches obviously lead to crackdowns on the left historically, to problematic aspects there. And it's important like to balance out what has to be done short term, because there has to be some response, and we have the institutions that we have, but there also needs to be that reckoning with the broader project and the appreciation that to pursue that project means like a different approach, even in instances where it's hard, because they're domestic terrorist white supremacist people that want to kill a lot of the people who might listen to this podcast in some instances, like at least in theory, and that like is something you have to deal with in a more like holistic way. And that's just not where we're at, I think. And it's hard to conceptualize what that might look like even, but I do think it is like tied into the left's project more generally, and that it's just like one of those areas where it seems like a cop out, but it's like the solution's kind of socialism on some level, and like it needs like social, and we're seeing the consequences of like not choosing socialism and it leading to barbarism with the rise of these reactionary forces, and like that again can't be solved by the Biden administration the way they're trying to solve it. And I'm not really sure at this point what can solve it. Again, maybe going back to like the cleaving of people like Matt Gaetz from our political culture and leading to a less radical media political environment from the likes of Fox and Tucker Carlson. But like Gaetz is like a very small example of that, and given just like the embrace of QAnon, given other forces, like it's just not going to happen. So there's like a lot going on there, and I just think it's important to note that like the groups that took part on the like reactionary events of the 6th. Like, those groups are very highly organized. They're integrated into one another on some level, and the reporting coming out about that in the New York Times specifically is just, I think, pretty important, as far as like there's a real sentiment on the left that says like these people aren't organized enough to be a threat. This isn't real fascism. This isn't something to be concerned with. And I think when you view it in the broader perspective of like the Rise of the Alt-Right series, like quintessential listening people, but if you put it in that broader perspective and that broader historical trajectory, there is a real need to appreciate that like these movements were nascent at one point, and look at what happened on the 6th, and that these movements were disparate and disconnected at one point, but look at how connected they were on the 6th, and that it's like something we have to take very seriously on the left, especially just given the history of reactionary movements and their obviously like interactions with integrated their interactions with minority populations, and just like their desire to enact the like ethno-state on some level. Like, obviously we have to like keep all of that like broader political project in mind, and appreciate like how much political power they've gained in the last few decades, and like their aims, and how like it's something you have to take very, very seriously, just because of that mismatch. And it might seem easy to like hand wave away, but we can't do that. We don't have the luxury to do that on the left. Millions and millions of people don't have that luxury. And even though we're in like the Biden era and things have calmed down a little bit and it's not as like focused, the like idea that the 6th was like a moment in history that signals the beginning of something worse, I think still needs to be in like front of mind when thinking of these movements. And it's still not a foreclosed possibility, especially if the solutions are carceral and not like political and cultural and socioeconomic on some level, and can actually like beat back those sentiments. But, you know, ultimately, that's just why socialism has to win, folks. It's the only way. So, you know, we'll see. I'll keep talking about that, about the death cult of COVID, about just the broader political moment we live in, what Joe Biden's doing, and the like ongoing fallout of the coup, and the like conservative political movement and how it's fractured post-Trump, what's happening there. I mean, we'll cover all of this stuff. Thank you, patrons, for all that you do. Please share the show with your friends, all that good stuff. Thank you for your support, though. We really appreciate it. It makes the show possible, and you know, there's going to be more content soon. Some early 20th century labor stuff, as I am wont to talk about, because, you know, it's kind of my thing. Go listen to the Eugene Debs series if you haven't already. It's back there in the back catalog somewhere. And it's my shit. So more of that coming, more for patrons, more news ramblings, all of that coming soon. Thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And I will see you next time. Bye.